Hello, welcome to Technically's Developers Conference during Philly Tech Week 2020. I'm Julie Zeglin, Technically's Managing Editor. I'm your MC for the day, and I'm moving you right along to the next case study. So we are going to be hearing next from Michael Winslow. He is with Comcast. He is going to be talking about what tech leaders must know about microservices. How do we, the tech leaders, have enough knowledge to make good decisions on the move to microservices? Michael will answer several core questions in this session. So, Michael, you can join us now. Welcome. How are you?
Good. Hi, Julie.
Hi. I'm going to hop off.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Winslow. I'm a senior director at Comcast, and I always like to put these things up here. And then one fun fact about myself is, even though I've moved into the management track, I came from a development background, and I still do some development for a lot of my management tasks. All right, let me just get control to my slides. And there we go. Okay. So this, gosh, I miss this place so much. This is the Comcast Technology Center in Philadelphia. This is where, up until March, I went to work every day with a great team. One thing I always like to point out when I do presentations, being a part of Comcast, is please do not forget the technology part. We are a tech company that was born from a cable company and a cable operator. It's been at least a decade to 12 years now that we've been in the technology space, and I think we're fully in there. So we love to do that. Just to give you a quick overview of Comcast, what we are known for, as far as in the Philadelphia area, mainly are these type of products: our X-Fi, the X1 service, Xfinity Mobile, and Xfinity Home. But our family is much bigger than that. We have Comcast Business, Comcast Spotlight, the Spectacor brands that we come, as far as the sports, the online gaming tournaments that we do. And then with the acquisition of NBC Universal and Sky, we basically have so many brands and companies that we do technology services for. And it's important to remember that when you think about Comcast as a company, you don't always have to box yourself into one small part. There's so many different places that we can go. Now, I am a huge fan of DevOps. So when I put this together, the first thing that I did was I wanted to change this slide to do this. You can watch really closely. I make those lines disappear. What I want to do in the DevOps world is just start blurring those lines between our operating companies, between our technology groups, and just share information on how we do things. I think that's a huge thing that we as a company are attempting to do and trying to do, and we're doing a good job at it. Okay, so I mentioned I'm a huge fan of DevOps. Basically, if you ever go out and Google me and put DevOps after the name, you probably have to do that because there's a more famous Mike Winslow than me. You'll see a lot of talks that I do about DevOps. It's a passion of mine. But I hate the name DevOps, to be honest. It does make you think that it just incorporates dev and ops. What I like more is this acronym that was coined by Damon Edwards and John Willis called CAMS. All right, and CAMS is an acronym that stands for culture, automation, measurement, and sharing. Okay, and that gives you a better idea of how I see DevOps. Okay, I'm always looking at, if somebody puts technology in front of me, how do you measure its effectiveness? How can we share it with others? I don't want to be the only one who knows about it. Automation is the known thing about DevOps, but the measurement, the sharing, and then the widespread culture in a company are things that make me excited about DevOps in addition to the automation piece. So you came to hear about microservices. Before we get into that, I just want to quickly give a shout out to a couple of people. You guys caught me on a great day. Today it was announced I just got a brand new position, went from director to senior director. And I cannot wait to work with my new team. So shout out to Arlene, J. Mike, Evan, Paul, and Jess. I'm going to be looking forward to working with you all very shortly. And now let's talk about microservices now that we have that aside. All right, let me just give you a quick background about why I'm qualified to give you this high-level overview. So I started as a principal developer in the web services on the Xfinity Mobile project in 2015. The team decided as a group to move to microservices, and then the team grew fast. We were, trying to get to a launch of a new product, which is Xfinity Mobile. And as the team grew, because I had so much knowledge from the very beginnings of this organization, I took on a leadership role so that I could lead and mentor new engineers and leaders that came in. So that gave me two unique perspectives on this move to microservices. Because I came in as a principal developer and now I have a leadership role, really I want to know, do I care about the cool tech along with microservices, or do I care about the business value? And I think, the answer in the end is a little bit of both. So in the end, all the way in the end, things worked out well, but it wasn't always sunshine throughout this process. So this is the part that I like. Usually when there's an audience in front of it, I like to get audience participation and say, what do you guys want to talk about next? Do you want to hear about the lessons we learned along the way, or do you just want to sit here and hear me talk about how great the team was that I had working on microservices? Red pill or blue pill? I'm guessing most of you say you want to hear about the lessons learned, but honestly, this is my presentation, so I'm going to pick the blue pill just for a minute, if you bear with me, because I could not sit up here and talk about the great things that we did at Xfinity Mobile and in other groups in relation to microservices without talking about the people that got it done. And so this is I went around when we were still in the office and got pictures with everybody that I could find that was part of the team that really got us going, moving to microservices. So, okay, seriously this time, let's talk about microservices. I want to quickly quote my uncle and my mentor, something he said to me years ago, and he said, a true seasoned professional should be able to speak for 5 minutes intelligently about any subject. And the reason I say this is because the main reason I initially made this presentation was in order to give some information to our leadership about what we were working on. Because it did seem to me as if the leadership had no clue what microservices were, but there was this groundswelling of engineers that said we must move to microservices. So I wanted to make them be able to speak for 5 minutes intelligently about it. And that was what originally made me come up with this presentation. So one thing you can ask your team as a leader, and I should probably say this is good for leaders and for newcomers to microservices, because in both instances, we want to break this down to a simpler form than what people usually dive right into the technology of microservices. And this is more high level. So please, I hope this is digestible by many. So one thing you can ask your team, are we all on the same page as to what a monolith is and what microservices are? So let's quickly go over what you should know about that. This box right here, this used to be called a service. But when microservices came along, they decided to give it a big chunky name that's hard to move. They called it now the monolith. Okay, this is what I got used to creating when I created web services early in my career. So what you would have here was an HTTP request would come into the service. It would hit a controller endpoint, a service which would do all the business logic, and then a repository layer, which is kind of like your stored data. Okay, and that would connect right to a database or perhaps even another web service. Okay, and on each of these levels, you would have it sliced up in certain ways to handle the logic that you wanted. In this case, let's say we have eligibility, user, and device in the controller. And you would often have a similar instance on each layer, so that calls would come from the top and go all the way through to the database. And there you might even find corresponding tables in the database for all of those different calls. Okay. So now let's talk about what a microservices is. As you can see on the presentation, it's smaller, but to be warned, it doesn't always mean that your file size is going to be smaller. Actually, our microservices were about 10 times larger than the monolith they replaced. Each microservice was, because there was a lot of boilerplate code in there. The idea of it being smaller, it just means it has a smaller job. So in the same way, an HTTP request can come in, but instead of coming directly into a controller and then being routed, it is very specific to a device in this case. And then it starts to look very similar to the monolith. That device microservice has a controller, a service, a repository, and a database. And then is repeated again with eligibility, user, and device. Okay, so where this helps out, if you're a leader listening, if you're a large organization with a lot of developers and you would like to break them up into small functional areas, this is a great pattern that can allow people to work specifically on the eligibility microservice or the user microservice or the device microservice in this case. Okay, now let's move it to the side. Now, if you remember when I talked about the monolith, there was one endpoint that came in that would allow you to get to eligibility, user, and device. Now, when you move to microservices the way that I just showed you, there are 3 different endpoints. And you can't tell your users to change everything about what their program, how their program worked, to now go to 3 different endpoints in this case. So what you need to do is basically create that one call that comes in. And to do that, we use a gateway in microservices. And now you're going to start to hear about particular products that we used. Okay, we use the open source library Netflix Zool to be our software-based gateway. Okay, in the AWS world, you might see API gateway. Is a very similar thing, but that is what helps spread out the calls between the microservices. Okay, so now the next question you might want to ask, how are we handling service discovery and auto scaling? Okay, I know I'm putting some new words in there, but we'll describe what they are here. So here's, as an example, you realize as you check your logs, oh no, for some reason, the eligibility API calls have gone way up, like 3 times as much traffic as the other 2 APIs. So what can you do in microservices world? You can actually go and register 2 more eligibility microservices in there. And as you can see, the gateway does not yet know about those 2 new microservices. And that's where the concept of service discovery comes in. Okay, so discovery, Netflix has a library called Eureka, which handles service discovery. And that allows, and in Amazon, that's ECS. And there's other tools out there, of course. What that allows it to happen is it says, hey, I see 2 new microservices in there. I need to register them behind that same gateway. And that's what Eureka does. Okay, now Netflix Ribbon comes in. And what Ribbon does is it basically says, I see that you have 3 eligibility microservices. When people come in and call the eligibility microservice, I want to load balance between those 3. I want to give it to the first one, the second one, the third one. I don't want to overwhelm any one of those 3 microservices. So that's what Netflix Ribbon does for you. And then Elastic Load Balancer and Amazon can do something similar. All right. So that's another note I want to call out. Elasticity is something that you get if you use Amazon or something. It's pretty much a check of the box if you set everything up the right way. The way that we did it, we didn't use Amazon. We kind of hand rolled everything. And so there was no auto discovery of our new microservices. We had to spin them up and register them ourselves. Sorry, we had to spin them up ourselves, and then they can be discovered. But in AWS, you can actually just check a box, and it can do auto scaling. Just be mindful of the cost that might be incurred in that case. Okay, so how do you handle fault tolerance and circuit breaker? You know, how do you handle failure conditions in this ecosystem? So let's give an example where all of a sudden the database goes down behind one of your eligibility microservices, and that causes your microservice to fail. Well, let's retry once. We don't want to cause a scare just yet. Twice, 3 times. I think we need to probably drop this one out of rotation, honestly. So goodbye, microservice. And basically, this is handled by another Netflix library called Hystrix. Hystrix handles graceful failover of microservices. Okay, so, and then unlike monoliths, here's the point here. In a monolith, if something went wrong right there, your whole object might be unusable at this point. In this case, you were able to just drop one of those objects out, and the user and device microservices and the remaining eligibility microservices still worked as they were supposed to. So a summary of what we've gone over so far: monoliths versus microservices. I went over the Netflix libraries that we used. So the benefits, you can spread the code base across functional teams. You get elasticity. You can limit the impact of failure or the blast radius. All right. So now here's another joke. We have nothing left to talk about. So why don't we talk about the lessons that we learned along the way? I hope that was a good primer to get you ready for this next part of it, because this is the realist part of what we went through as a team. So if you look out on the web, sometimes you'll find a very snarky answer to this question: is there a need to move to microservices? And I found this handy dandy little flowchart that basically says, are you Netflix? No. So that was really snarky, and there were people that felt that way in the same way. You really should have a need to move to microservices, and we went over a couple of them earlier, but let's go through some of the points and problems that we had that, there were times where we were like, well, I wonder if this was a good idea moving to microservices or not. So I want to quote a very good friend and an engineer of mine that worked on this project with me. Complexity begets complexity. Soon tools are needed to manage the complexity, then tools are needed to manage those tools. And that's Ryan Emerly. You can check him out on Twitter. He loves when he finds out that he gets a new follower because of a presentation that I did. Very, very smart engineer, unbelievable. And we thought about this all the time. So the next thing you might want to ask, do we know how much our log file storage and network traffic will increase when we move to microservices? Okay, so let's do this through a sample real quick. We need to call our API to determine if a particular user is eligible to purchase a device. Okay, and we're going to use that same structure that we came up with. So you can see a scoreboard at the top. We're going to keep track on how does the system logs and app logs grow in each of the different ways of doing things. So in the monolith, you can see two dotted lines come in. We're going to call those are process boundaries, okay? Every time you cross a process boundary, you create a syslog, a system log. So let's talk about how this works. So you come into the eligibility controller, and then that creates one syslog entry, and we're going to leave that right there. Then you call the eligibility service, which then needs to make a call across to the user service because we want to find out is the user eligible to purchase the device. The user then goes out to the database and pulls back the user information. Okay. We then want to get information about the device because we want to match up the user to the device. So that same call goes to the device service, goes to the repository, and makes a call to the database. Okay, so to get the information that you need to determine if a person is eligible to buy a device, in the monolith, in this case, made 3 syslog entries. All right, so now let's talk about it in the microservices world. Okay, the first thing you're going to notice, there's a lot more process boundaries in microservices. Okay, so when you come into the gateway alone, you just created a syslog. Okay, then you make your call to eligibility. You've created another system log. All right, and then the eligibility service, depending on how you choose to do this, and we chose to do it so that it would contact the user microservice the same way any service coming in would. So you literally go outside of the API gateway and then come back into the user microservice. That is 2 calls. Then it goes and hits the database. Then you do the same thing with the device microservice, goes and hits the database. Okay, so if you're keeping score to do the same exact call and get the same exact information, it made 8 syslog entries for the microservice, 3 for the monolith. Okay, so, and by the way, the other thing that you would have to worry about here is those extra process boundaries could actually create more surface area for attacks. You know, before you had to stop people from getting to one service, now you have to stop them from getting to each microservice and even the gateway associated to it. So that's something to be aware of. So what? Microservices inflate the system logs a little and the security risk. It's totally worth it, right? It's like, maybe, but let's keep talking about some other lessons that we learned. So how about we ask our team, how do you make sure that we can diagnose production issues? Okay, so if we go back to our chart here, if you come into let's say you come in and you want to make an eligibility call, and that makes it to the eligibility service, and then you get a failure in the user repository. Hands up if anybody have ever seen anything like this before, a stack trace. All right, I'm sure that there's a lot of hands that go up. But the interesting thing is when you have a stack trace, we can find out that the error that we encountered was variable username is null. And then you can actually trace it all the way back up to the original call coming into the monolith. So it started in the user repository, which was called by the user service, which was called by the eligibility service, which was called by the eligibility controller. So you can walk it back all the way to the point of origin. Okay, so to be able to figure out the origin of this, it took 1 app log entry, although they can be kind of large. And the reason a stack trace can do this because it has visibility to everything that's in the monolith. All right, so now let's try this in a microservice. Same exact idea. It comes into the eligibility microservice, comes back out, has the same error in the repository of the user service. And this is what you see this time. And the biggest difference is everything that you're seeing at this point is from a user point of view. So the user microservice, it has no visibility to the original call, which came into eligibility at this point. Okay, so the stack trace only has visibility of the current microservice. All context of where the request came from is lost. Okay, and that brings us into the idea of we need distributed tracing if we move to microservices, and all the logs that come with it. So distributed tracing, to give you a quick background, when distributed computing became big, Google wrote a paper because they knew that it was coming, called Dapper. Okay, and that foreshadowed the need for this distributed tracing that was coming on. Twitter then implemented their version called Zipkin. We created a version at Comcast called Money. It was very specific to a lot of our needs, but it is open source. You can take a look at it if you want to. And then recently, last year, a couple of the big creators got together and started creating open telemetry. And just a quick shout out, Paul Cleary, you could reach out to him if you ever want to talk about the Money product at Comcast. So to quote another one of our people, we used to use distributed tracing to track transactions across applications. Now we need to track transactions within a single application. So that's distributed tracing is not new, but using it at such a small scale for what used to be a monolith is kind of a new concept. And please reach out to Catherine. I love giving out everybody's information on here. Okay, so let's just quickly show you how this works. So you would come into the API gateway, and at that moment you would create something called a correlation ID. Okay, and if you can see here on the left, we have in the logs log that correlation ID with anything that we log about this particular transaction. Okay, so once we're inside, we keep logging that correlation ID as we go through our microservices. Okay, and then when we hit that error at the end, okay, and we want to go and investigate it, we go and find out what is the correlation ID of that error, and we find all those instances in the logs. Now, there's a lot of tools that can help you out with this, but this is the basic idea of how distributed tracing works there. But what you can see is the cost that comes along with keeping all this logging along with your microservices traffic. Okay, so this is a very, very conservative estimate, but you could, at minimum, raise your logs and your storage by 4 times the amount that you did before when you move to microservices. So networking and storage are big things that need to be taken into account when you move to microservices. The other thing is what you used to do for one item in your organization, you now have to do for many. So how do we plan to roll out these changes incrementally or all at once? And I'm going to zoom through a lot of this coming up. So basically, you don't have to lean in too much on this chart. This is a chart that I put together when our team first decided to move from a monolith to microservices. Okay, and this line across the top represents that everything that we had in place as far as CI/CD, security scans, everything that we had in place for the original microservice. We were running really smoothly that way. So when we decided to, sorry, that was the original monolith. When we decided to move to microservices, the red parts represent things that we kind of just didn't take care of right away because we were just so in a hurry to break up that monolith into microservices. Okay, so the idea was code reviews and CI. You know, we were dropping a lot of DLLs manually, not DLLs, war files manually. CD to continuous deployment to all environments was not there. We were, like I said, we were rolling some of this stuff out manually. Firewalls became pretty bad in the idea that what used to be one single call was now behind some firewalls. Okay, and security scans was always the last thing to think about, right? Eventually we got this all right, but these were things that were neglected in the beginning when we first moved to microservices. So suggestion here is do not create all your microservices at once. Look up the strangler pattern. That is a way to basically slowly and incrementally move out changes and move out old code. Monitor the usage of your most utilized endpoints before you ever move to microservices, and use that as a plan to maybe decide which microservices you want to peel off. Okay, have a template for the new microservices. Don't let all your team members come up with their own way of doing microservices. If you're trying to break it down, have a template and use it. Okay, we're getting towards the end. So change management team, they want release notes, okay? Release notes became such a big problem in our organization once we moved to microservices that I did a talk on this automated release notes that we created, because it became very, very hard to manually create release notes once you went from delivering one WAR file to delivering a possibility of 20 to 30 WAR files. Because release management still wants all of those things to be scanned, and they want reasons for all of them to be deployed. So our release notes ended up looking something like this. I'll go through it real quick. Each one of our microservices would be listed here. We would have a score of the security scan that went through. We would have the results of our tests. We would have the Jenkins job that rolled it out, and then the rollback plan if anything went wrong, how you would roll back each one of them. Okay. So then version control becomes a problem when you move to microservices as well, because if you think about it, before, your release of a monolith was basically whatever the version number of the monolith was, you could say that was the version of your release as well. Now the release is basically a aggregation of all the different release numbers of the microservices. So you have to keep a tag of the main release and associate that to many microservices. That can be very, very, very hard to keep track of if that's something that you need to keep track of. And I want to keep it real here. Definitely this was something, we had a heavy deadline that we had to meet during all of this. And I want to make sure that everybody understands that there is a human cost to making decisions like this. And so ask, is our team prepared for the task given our existing workload? That is something that we should definitely ask. And somewhere around last year, the World Health Organization actually classified burnout as an official medical disorder. So you could go check it out there. Okay, so let's summarize the whole thing with a couple of do's and don'ts. Do please have a reason to move to microservices, whether it's resiliency, cost optimization, breaking up your team into smaller teams. Please don't practice resume-driven development. Don't just do it because microservices is hot, and even going further now these days, functions as a service and other items are even hotter. Okay. Do have a plan for monitoring, telemetry, and distributed tracing. Please have that going in. You're not going to be able to count on traditional logging techniques like stack trace. Okay. Please peel off one microservice at a time. This is if you're breaking down a monolith. Don't refactor everything at once. You'll never know with all the moving parts what is really causing the problems when you run into them. Please understand that all teams are impacted, not just yours. So if you're a dev team and you make this decision, you're affecting the way QA looks at you, release management, security, etc. You are not the only team, and you do not exist in a vacuum. Don't say we're doing microservices YOLO. You know, that's just not a nice thing to do to your teammates. Okay? Please staff appropriately and monitor employee health. That goes with all things, not just moves to microservices. Please don't ignore the human impact of your decision to move to microservices. Okay, and then I will finish up with one, final do and don't. Please do encourage DevOps teams to pursue microservices if there are benefits to your organization. Don't underestimate the time, effort, and money involved. And with that, I say thank you to everybody. Black Lives Matter. Please check out Comcast and the Bengineers. And if we have time for questions, I love it. If not, please contact me at any time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Am I live? Can we see me?
Yes, we can see you, Julie. You're live.
Great, thank you. Thank you again, Michael Winslow from Comcast. We are moving through